Venezuela, home to the Andes, Angel Falls, diverse wildlife, and some of the most beautiful people in the world, has unfortunately been making headlines for all the wrong reasons over the past few years. Unless you're living under a rock, you must be aware that a financial crisis has hit Venezuela, which once used to be the wealthiest nation of Latin America. This South American country has been caught in a downward spiral for years, with growing political discontent, further fueled by skyrocketing hyperinflation, power cuts, and shortages of food and medicine. While we look at major world events, we often fail to understand the causes and the implications of the said event. For example, at the peak of the Venezuelan crisis, the mainstream media had been incessantly reporting on the hyperinflation using the anecdotal example of how it was cheaper to use Venezuelan bolivar as toilet paper than toilet paper itself, because buying toilet paper would be more expensive. Well, the point that I'm trying to make here is that very few of these media houses dwelled upon what exactly led to the escalation of the problem as we were seeing it then. And that is the kind of gap that we will attempt to bridge with our explainer episodes. What were the reasons behind the historic boom, the eventual fall, and the current resurgence of the economy of the petrostate that is Venezuela? Is this a mere dead cat bounce, or is the nature of this stability permanent? Well, these are some of the questions that this episode will be grappling with, so stay tuned. In order to understand the crisis as we contemporarily see it, it is essential that we briefly dwell on the chronological timeline to understand the emergence of Venezuela as a petrostate. And this history can be traced back to as early as the 1920s, when in 1922, Royal Dutch Shell geologists at La Rosa, a field in Venezuela, discovered oil which blew out at what was then an extraordinary rate of 100,000 barrels per day, instantly catapulting Venezuela into a petrostate. All this talk of a petrostate surely begs the question, what is a petrostate, right? Well, petrostate is a term that is usually referred to a country whose economy generates most of its income through the export of oil and natural gas. These petrostates have weak political institutions as most power is concentrated in the hands of a few elites. And they are also susceptible to the Dutch disease, a term which is coined by economists to describe the unhealthy dependence on the export of natural gas and oil. True to this definition, within a few years of having discovered oil, more than 100 foreign companies were producing oil in Venezuela, and this move was backed by the then dictator, General Juan Vicente Gomez. And by the time he died in 1935, the other aspects of the definition had become a reality as well. The Venezuelan bolivar had ballooned, and oil shoved aside other sectors to account for 90% of exports. This economic growth and success spelled well into the next couple of decades. In 1960, Venezuela joined Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia as a founding member of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, more commonly referred to as the OPEC. In the same year, Venezuela established its first state oil company and increased oil companies' income tax to 65% of profits. In 1973, a 5-month OPEC embargo on countries backing Israel in the Yom Kippur War quadrupled oil prices and made Venezuela the country with the highest per capita income in Latin America. However, in 1980s, Venezuela experienced its first jolt when the global oil prices plummeted. During this period, Venezuela's economy contracted and inflation soared. At the same time, it managed to accrue massive foreign debt when it purchased foreign refineries. But really, it was during the 1990s and 2000s that the tide truly turned for the worse. In 1999, Hugo Chavez was elected the president, pledging to use Venezuela's vast oil wealth to reduce poverty and inequality. While his costly Bolivarian missions expanded social services and did manage to cut poverty by 20%, he also took several steps that precipitated a long and steady decline in the country's oil production. Furthermore, in the typical fashion of a megalomaniac, Chavez expanded the powers of the presidency and edged the country towards authoritarianism. Chavez held office until 2013 with an iron fist, post which he was succeeded by his right-hand man Nicolas Maduro. During his first term, the economy went into a free fall. While Venezuela had begun experiencing continuous and uninterrupted inflation since 1983 with double-digit annual rates, inflation rates became the highest in the world in 2014 under Maduro, and they continued to increase in the following years. The government catastrophe began with government price controls and plummeting oil prices, which caused state-run oil companies to go bankrupt. To cope with this problem, the government started printing new money. Thus, prices rose rapidly, unemployment increased, and the GDP all but collapsed. This economic crisis was further aggravated thanks to the international sanctions which were applied by the governments of United States, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, Panama, and Switzerland against people associated with the administration of Maduro. And these sanctions, they had come in response to repression during the 2014 and 2017 Venezuelan protests. In the past 8 years, hyperinflation and the aforementioned international sanctions program against Venezuela had a devastating effect on the entire population's living conditions. Shortages of basic supplies had become widespread, prompting more than 5.6 million people to leave. In fact, the inflation rate in February 2019 had reached, wait for it, a whopping 3,44,509%. With the outbreak of the pandemic, the economy was hurt even further. Venezuela continued to experience hyperinflation until last year as the economy had all but collapsed. Now that we have looked at the past, it is time we address the astonishing recovery that the Venezuelan economy is making the headlines for. Several reports are suggesting that the Venezuelan economy has been growing significantly in Q1 of 2022. In January 2022, Bloomberg reported that Venezuela had managed to break one of the world's longest hyperinflation bouts. The statistics of the report evidence that the monthly inflation rate has been under 50% for the past 12 months. In fact, another report published by Reuters in April 2022 claims that Venezuela's inflation has slowed down to the rate of 1.4% in March, which is the lowest in almost a decade. Make no mistake, the rate of inflation in Venezuela still remains one of the highest in the world. However, the mentioned statistics are testimony to the fact that Venezuela has been on the right course in terms of recovery. Now, what have been the reasons for this recovery, you may ask? Well, it is a culmination of several factors which has ushered in positive changes in the economy. Most observers are of the consensus that the biggest reason for this transformation has been the doubling of oil production. The country's beleaguered energy sector has managed to more than double production over the last 2 years in around 7 lakh barrels a day. The information is even supported by data from OPEC. This has been supplemented by the overall increase in the prices of crude oil, which have provided further relief and advantage to the Venezuelan government. With more foreign earnings from its largest export pouring in, imports and consumption are on the rise. Another major factor which has provided a much-needed impetus to the economy has been the informal dollarization of the economy. Informal dollarization means that there has been a widespread use of the US dollar as the Venezuelan bolivar drifted towards irrelevancy. This process, which almost went unnoticed in mainstream media, was even supported by the socialist government despite their natural aversion to the dollar. Furthermore, the government of Nicolas Maduro has increased flexibility on trade controls and the exchange rate, even selling its capital participation in companies that were confiscated when Hugo Chavez was in power. These factors have slowly but surely been promoting the revival of the economy. The most convincing indication has been the fact that United States government is moving to ease a few economic sanctions on Venezuela as well. The country has the world's largest proven crude reserves and once pumped 3 million barrels a day. If the US eases sanctions, new investment could spur an additional boost to production of as much as 3 lakh barrels a day. Such has been the recovery that some of the 6 million migrants that had fled Venezuela are now coming back home. There has been an increase in expenditure. This is a quote from Bloomberg, verbatim. Quote, "With signs of their arrival are piling up everywhere in Caracas, in the booming market for apartment rentals, in the surge in private school enrollments, in the cars clogging streets once left empty by the exodus, and in the scores of freshly painted shops throwing their doors open to customers for the first time. In small towns along the western border with Colombia, it's evident too. For years, the traffic was only one way, out. Now locals say just as many people are coming home as leaving." Unquote. However, now is too soon to tell whether this stability is a mainstay for the Venezuelan economy. The biggest reason that commentators and observers cite as the source of their hesitance is, ironically, the very man who has been at the helm of this positive change, Nicolas Maduro. Maduro, for all his current embrace of capitalism, remains to his core an authoritarian who shows no indication of being interested in institutional change. Under the tutelage of Chavez, he witnessed the use of organized crime groups as instruments of state power. He implemented his predecessor's methods to tighten his grip on power. When in 2018, Maduro was re-elected president in a poll that analysts described as sham, he refused to step down despite the international condemnation embargoes. Emma Ashford, an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University and the author of the book Oil, the State and War, made an interesting point when she said that foreign policy of oil-dependent states is often driven by personalities rather than by a professionalized policy-making process. It is natural then to be wary of Maduro, an authoritarian, and for one to ask themselves, is Maduro's embrace of liberalization and revival of economy all but a facade for him to silence protests and remain in power? In a globalized world, the impact of a certain event felt in one country does not remain concentrated to it. Just as the Venezuelan government is now starting to learn its lessons and making amends, there are several lessons that the mishandlings of the Venezuelan government teaches other nations as well. It is essential that we look inwards and voice our discontent when we witness corruption, inflation, price rises amongst many other things. The free and fair structure of a democracy blesses us with the opportunity to identify, critique, correct, and thereby curb the situation from worsening. As for Venezuela, its road to recovery will not be easy, short, or simple. However, with the support of the international community, opening of the economy, and the reformation within the Maduro government itself, there is a unique opportunity to guide the first essential steps in the road to recovery. It remains to be seen how Venezuela will cope with its current state of resurgence. We at Speaking Territory will keep tracking the events unraveling in Venezuela and the world at large. If contemporary geopolitical stories such as this one interest you, be sure to follow us on Spotify, Twitter, and Facebook, as with episodes releasing every Monday and Friday, we have a lot more in store for you. So stay tuned.